This is a typical Norwegian fjord. It's not particularly interesting and there's not a lot going on, but 80 years ago this place was marked with the biggest red circle on all the maps in the British Admiralty and the RAF. Today only these two concrete moorings are all that remains of what was once a busy naval port facilities, and with the clues like Norwegian fjord, World War II and concerned British naval personnel, I think that most people will rightfully come to the conclusion that this is in fact the mooring of the German battleship Tirpitz. With me living about an hour away from Tirpitz's old base, I had to make a diorama out of it when I got this kit for my birthday. Sadly for you guys, I initially didn't plan on making a video on this build, so therefore there's not a lot of footage of me building this model or painting it. However, I will summarize it for you fairly quickly here. The kit's made by Tamiya and I bought an upgrade set with all the wooden decks and loads of PE parts. The kit itself fits together perfectly and the details are fine, and for its price range I think it's a very nice kit. I wanted to make it sort of historically accurate with the diorama setting and everything, so when I based my paint scheme on this March 1942 camouflage paint that Tirpitz had when she was based at the Vattenfjord before she deployed to Operation Sportsplatz, where the Germans tried to sink convoy PQ-12 unsuccessfully. And I know it's not the most interesting paint scheme and it's not the most complex one, shut up about that, but this thing was very quick to paint and it's historically accurate, so I'm going to go with it, and if you have any complaints about that you can take it up with my lawyers. I did however do one critical error, and that was I didn't listen to the voices in my head and I decided to do as the paint guy said and buy Humbrol paints. But more on that later, because that almost broke me. Anyway, here I am applying a black wash to the wooden decks, and quite liberal amounts. I also use several types of brown washes, and I use the darker ones close to the superstructure, the doors, turrets and other equipment on the deck where there would have been more wear and tear. So it looks pretty good, I'm pretty happy with it. And we have the similar situation with the Tirpitz model as we did with the Lesser Layer Royale, and that is that the model is too massive to actually fit on my desk, so the pictures are terrible. I apologize for all the clutter in the background, but hey ho, the ship doesn't look too bad, does it? But I think it would look pretty nice. So the next step I had to put myself through was to clear coat the entire model, and well, yeah, look at this. I genuinely don't want to do this because I think the ship looks great. I don't know what's going to happen now. Oh, wish me luck. And that's when I learned to always test spray the models on the underside first, because what the fuck is this supposed to be? This is Humbrol paint reacting with Humbrol clear coat and causing my entire model to look like absolute garbage. And look at this, the paint cracking and flaking all over the place. I mean, seriously, how does it even happen? I was fucking furious when this stains showed themselves next morning, and the one time I used Humbrol, the one time this thing happened. So if someone have their address, please send it to me so I can send them a fucking letter of What? Why did this go off? Who set this one off? Oh, I guess you're right, Mexican Mr. Bean. We should get back to it. Where were we? Oh yeah, the diorama base. I started making the base of my diorama the way I always do, with a big board of XPS foam and loads of scraps from my previous build. Once the coastline and mountainous terrain looked alright, I got my new and fancy blowtorch just to create some more natural looking shapes in the terrain and also make the surface rougher so that the Mod Podge and the plaster I would stick on later would stick a little bit better. I painted the bottom of the sea in this dark blue, but later it turned out that this step would not be necessary because I mixed in way too much paint in the resin, but you know, it's still nice to be 100% sure. I then waited to put the plaster to dry completely, which took about 24 hours, and then I lightly sanded it down to remove my finger indentations and smooth over the rough surface. For the paint job I kept it super simple. I just used a variation of dark grey as my base layer, then a light grey on top for dry brushing and to make the contrast pop a little bit more. All in all, I think it came out really well and it's super simple to do. So I also painted a lot of streaks and highlights on the mountainside just to make the cliffs and edges stick out a little bit more, and I think it looks really good to me at least. Then went on making more details that are also historically accurate, like anti-aircraft gun emplacements. There are several dozen small bunkers and concrete fortifications spread around the anchorage that have been used to house machine guns, flak guns and searchlights, but some also contain smoke dispensers that were used to cover up the ship when the British showed up with their pesky Lancasters and mosquitoes. Anyway, as you can see, I made the fortifications with some small bits of XPS that I covered with Mod Podge and then painted them in the most concrete-like colour I have, and I then put in guns and searchlights from other model kits that I have laying around. HMS Dreadnought is never going to be finished, I am so sorry. Another detail I had to add were the two concrete moorings that I showed you in the beginning of this video. I just carved these out of some foam, slapped some paint on them and then glued some bollards on so it's clear for everyone what they actually are for. After being thoroughly satisfied with my terrain, I went on using this shrubbery foliage from Woodland Scenics and covered up 3/4 of everything I'd done so far. I found that a solution of about 90% PVA glue and 10% water worked okay to make this stuff attached to the terrain, and then coated a liberal amount of area before just squeezing the foliage onto it. Some places where I wanted a particular look I glued individual pieces on one at a time, and although time consuming, I think it looks fairly good, at least from a distance. Throughout building the scenery, I tried to pay close attention to the aerial photos of the real anchorage because I wanted this model to look as accurate as possible, while simultaneously conveying the story of the Tirpitz when she brought both Fair and the RAF to my area. And speaking of historically accurate, I put a submarine and E-boat in the scene as well, because both of these types of vessels were served from the naval facilities here during the war. I painted the submarine in a pattern that I just simply thought looked cool and would make the scene look a bit more interesting to look at. And for the E-boat, I just went with the suggestions that came on the box. They also got a light weathering, but this time I used a Tamiya clear, because the Humbrol paint can go play in traffic for all I care. However, this is where my little twist comes in. I've actually pulled a sneaky on you, and this has been a history lesson this entire time. But you are committed now, and trust me, you want to hear this bit. Tirpitz spent almost all of her wartime career just floating around Norwegian fjords and being a target for British ingenuity. Most people with an interest in naval history have heard about the bombing raids from the RAF and the Royal Navy. Wikipedia actually lists 18 air raids while Tirpitz was in Norway, and also the mini-sub operation made by X-Craft. But did you know that there was a previous mini-sub attack that was carried out by a combined detachment of Norwegian and British Special Forces? Well, let me tell you about Operation Title in the history segment of this video. After a number of failed air attacks, the Secret Operations executives formed a new and bold plan, Operation Title. 2 Chariot manned torpedoes would be put on a common Norwegian fishing boat hauled across the North Sea in the middle of winter, submerge the chariots once in calm waters, tow them below the boat, bluff their way through loads of German checkpoints, sail to within striking distance of the Tirpitz while she was anchored in the Fatten Fjord, detach the chariots, strike and sink the Tirpitz, then round up all the crew and escape to Sweden. This was the plan that was presented to a man that had already been talked about on this channel quite recently. It was Captain Leif Larsen of the Shetland Gang. Captain Larsen took his crew of 7 other Norwegians plus 2 British chariot operators on board the fishing boat Arthur, which is the one that I'm showing you in the background here, and they set off to strike the Tirpitz in November 1942. I'll just give you the highlight of their journey here, and boy oh boy, these men did not have it easy. On the way over the North Sea, the brutal conditions caused almost everyone to be seriously seasick. The engine broke down several times over, so they had to erect sails for a large part of the trip. The courier that was supposed to give them the fake travel documents forgot that he was part of the operation, so Larsen had to say the code word to him 3 times before the old man realized who he was talking to. The Germans had patrolled boats everywhere and stopped and inspected them twice, but found nothing. The 2 Brits were hiding in a secret room, weapons drawn. A fisherman and his granddaughter spotted the chariots, but were bribed with butter to stay quiet. The piston of the engine cracked in the middle of the night, so they had to find and wake up a random Norwegian blacksmith, use his forge for 2 hours, and then get it going again. Amazingly, they managed to sail within 10 miles of the Tirpitz until the weather once again turned seriously foul, and devastatingly, both the chariots started smashing against each other and against the hull of Arthur, and both the chariots came loose and sank to the bottom with the Tirpitz well within sight. The operation had to be abandoned after that, and while they had to scuttle Arthur, the 10 men tried to escape to Sweden, and 9 of them were successful. Sadly, able seaman Bob Evans was shot by German forces, captured, interrogated, and executed. Even though the operation was a failure in the end, it paved the way for Operation Source, which followed on a year later, where the larger X-Craft mini-submarine successfully attacked Tirpitz and caused severe damage to the battleship that would never be fully operational again. For some reason, the story of Operation Title is not very well known today, but I wanted to do a little what-if twist to my build and include Arthur and one of the chariots to the diorama, so that I can tell their story. I therefore had a friend of mine create a model of Arthur, which I then had 3D printed, and then stuck a lot of random naval equipment on, like rigging, lifeboat and stuff, and this is what I came up with. Once the fishing boat is assembled and painted, I took a paravane from another model kit I had laying around and put 2 small plastic pieces on top of it so it looks a bit like a chariot, and then I glued it to the side of the fishing boat. I know the real operation they would of course have launched the chariot much farther away, but I simply do not have a big enough house to make a realistic perception of distance, so this is the best you get. I have continuously been screwing up resin pours, so this time I tried to do it properly with a proper formwork sealed off with hot glue and plexiglass. I poured in a thin layer of resin to cover the entire base and seal it, and then I made sure to cover everything in resin so that I would have no leaks when I did my main pour. I used a stirring stick and a ruined paintbrush to cover the resin everywhere, and I left it to dry for about 2 days. When I went back to the Tirpitz herself for the weathering process, the full extent of the Humbrol coat disaster dawned on me. What I believe has happened is the enamel paint reacted with the clear coat in some way and acted like a paint stripper that resulted in the paint curling up and looking like absolute trash. That meant that I could not go on with my regular weathering process either, because every time I applied enamel thinner or alcohol spirits to make the oil paints flow more naturally, it reacted with the bottom layer of paint and started stripping it off. So I had to give up trying to weather the hull of the ship entirely. I did apply 3 coats of Tamiya clear in an effort to present the paint job I had already done, but the enamel thinner still reacted with the first coat of regular paint. If you have any idea why this happened and how, please let me know before I head over to the Humbrol HQ and start hurling wet Brussels sprouts at them. Before the main pour of resin, I glued the submarine and the Tirpitz into the sealed base so that they would not float away. I used a liberal amount of hot glue on the underside just to be sure, and then a lot more around the hull and the hole that it's in. I then mixed up my resin and put way too much paint in it. I prefer the Tamiya XF17 as my sea color, and then started the main pour. I made sure to use the back end of an old brush to make the resin spread evenly around the edges and the shoreline, and also the hull of both the battleship and the submarine. And I was very happy with the pour. And I then came back to see that everything had seeped through the foam and was on the floor, and everything had to be scraped up with a chisel and be redone. I still have no idea how to pour resin, and I have no idea how this happened. And I was even so confident I'd done this correctly this time. I made this form, I've sealed it with glue and with another layer of resin, but no. Another unsuccessful resin build for me, and I would have stopped doing these a long time ago if it wasn't for the word resin being a hit buzzword in the YouTube algorithm. After my second main pour, everything was sealed, thank God, and I used my small blowtorch to remove all the bubbles on the surface, and that worked like a treat finally, and the entire surface looked just like glass. I've always found that model ships look a bit dull and lifeless without a crew on board, so for this build I splurged and bought a set of German photo-etched sailors which I dotted around randomly on the ship. I put them in a location that would be natural to have crew stationed on them, like the bridge, the lookout, some gun emplacement and some around other equipment. I feel like the ship becomes much more alive this way, and it looks much more interesting. Another way to make the diorama come to life is to make things happen in the background, so I made it look like they're launching a float plane from the crane. This gave me a perfect excuse to do something with the plane, and I just attached it simply with a piece of steel wire. Another detail I felt was needed was the torpedo nets. Tirpitz was protected by torpedo nets at all our anchorages in Norway, and they are visible in several historical photographs, and they are quite distinct. I found a brilliant way to make these when I walked past my local wool knitting shop, and I spotted these brilliant little pearl thingies. I simply put them on a piece of steel wire, primed them, painted them, and then superglued them directly onto the resin. I made sure to go all the way around the ship, as well as the submarine and the E-boat, and at this point I could really see the final layout start to come together. I always do some sort of final adjustments to my builds when things are near complete, and this time was no different. I fiddled around with the E-boat for quite a bit before I decided to just moor it alongside the submarine and then use some string and tie them together. I also took one of Tirpitz's lifeboats and painted it in civilian colours, so that it looked like the ship is being visited by a doctor or a maritime pilot for some reason. It just gave me the excuse to use this lifeboat model and also add the ladder on the outside of the hull. It's just some extra details to bring a bit more life to the model. For my final few touches, I weathered my Arthur model quite heavily and glued it in place just on the edge of my diorama. I also added crew to this little boat, so if you look very closer you can see the two divers in the sea right next to the chariot. Then tragedy struck, and my trusty camera stand that has been vital to my video production for the last 5 years finally completely broke, so the footage from here on out is sadly going to be shaky and limited. Sorry old friend, RIP in peace. I finished the torpedo net with some string that I threaded through the holes in the pearls, and then I used my gloss gel to make it stick to the surface properly. I covered the entire resin with this product, and it made the sea look a lot more realistic, and it adds another beautiful detail to the whole scenery. Application is made with a brush, and then everything is roughed up to look like a slightly turbulent sea state. And that really is all that is to it. Now, I hope you're ready for the final reveal. Thank you so much to all of you who watched this video all the way through. This was a massive effort, it took a lot of time. I even wrote a script for the first time in my life, and I hope you liked the way I did it. Thank you so much again. Please subscribe, please like, and I'll see you in the next one.